Hey, I'm Minosaur, and I want to share some tricks that I use to make my electronic music feel living, breathing, and alive. And I'm going to do that by breaking down one of my tracks called Dead Climb. Here's a clip. Over on the Cable Guys channel, I get tons of comments asking about my music, so I'll put all the links down below, and I hope you enjoy this breakdown. Okay, so this is the Ableton live session for Dead Climb. In terms of a concept for the track, I often like to start with a concept or an idea. For this one, I wanted lots of noise, lots of aggression, but mainly I wanted it to feel like a living, breathing organism where everything's moving and evolving, never stands still. And for the bass, I wanted it to feel larger than life, not just the sound itself, but the way it interacts with the mix, the way it pushes through the other elements and crushes things out of the way. So I'll show you the bass in a sec, but first let's look at this lead that runs through the track, this lead synth. It evolves as the track progresses and it's constantly changing. If you look at the automation on here, there's tons of automation and things going on. So I've got this stem of it here. I'll just play a few parts so you can hear how it changes. So anyway, the lead itself is actually really simple. I'm going to go back to the actual channel here. I'm going to turn off all these effects and we'll just listen to the sound on its own. Now I'll mute this arpeggiator. So it's just one note, that's the original patch. And there's this pitch bend here on every bar. So if I turn this arpeggiator on, you can see it's on free mode. It's on free rate here. And if I go into the automation and open this up, you can see here. So this already gives it quite a wonky feel because it's not playing notes on the grid, it's just free running because of this arpeggiator. And I can change the speed of this to get faster or slower. In terms of the sound itself, it's just a basic Serum patch. We've got a single sine oscillator here. This one isn't audible in the mix, it's just FMing this oscillator with an envelope. Then there's a sub-oscillator, but it's actually tuned up +2 octaves. So it's playing a really high triangle wave, and that gets mixed in at some points in the track. Like that, as you can hear. This obviously sounds very weak, very weedy. It's all about the distortion on this sound. So we'll just turn all these effects off. Actually, first we've got a corpus here. But it's really this pedal that's doing the heavy lifting. That corpus is just gives it a nice flavour. Then we've got a bit more drive. This drum flanger preset in echo. OTT. Then it's just kind of bread and butter stuff like EQs, a bit of limiting, so a little bit of EQ dipping out the mids there. Nothing too crazy. And that's kind of it in terms of sound designing the lead. What is interesting is the automation. So I'll open up a bunch of these. I mean, you can see all these things down here I've automated. And when it comes to sound design, a lot of people say design your synth patches in separate sessions. But here I didn't do that. Sometimes I like to actually start designing a patch as I'm writing the track, adding the distortion, adding all these effects, doing all the automation as I'm writing the parts and putting it all together. And that is actually a valid way to work because the track builds around the sound as you're creating it. I don't know if this sound would work that well in another track it's designed for this production. Just going back to the arpeggiator automation that we looked at earlier, when the track hits the breakdown, you'll hear it does this slow winding up effect. I'll play in the track. So to achieve that effect, I automated the arpeggiator from slow to fast. And then on the bus here as well, if I can find it somewhere, I think it's on here. Yeah, there we go. We've got this lead being sent to a big reverb here. So we're sort of slowly winding up and adding all this cavernous reverb. So it gives it that big windy up reverby feel. And one moment I really like is when the track drops back in. I actually previously tried to lock the automation back onto its original starting point, and it didn't sound quite as good. I ended up sort of gradually just letting it wind back down again, just as the track drops in. You'll hear what I mean when I play it now. Just got that chaotic feel. Okay, next let's look at the bass in the track. So the bass itself is actually a stem bounced out of an old session. And interestingly, it's got this vocal baked in as well. And I've actually ended up using that in the track as well. So because it's a stem, I can't really take you into the actual design of the bass itself, but I think that's not even the most interesting thing in this track. What is interesting is how everything else responds to the bass. So the concept here is I wanted the bass to feel larger than life, like it's pushing through the speakers, like it's crunching everything out of the way and creating this feeling of pressure. And the way that I did that was I've got this squash bus here, and that's got my hats, rides and noise all bussed together. And what I've done here is I've put a copy of the bass signal into this squash bus. Now if I solo this, you can't actually hear it very well, and that is because on this bus I've got an EQ carving out all the lows. So if I take this EQ off, and I'll take off this saturation as well. So I'm taking a copy of the bass and I'm really boosting the low end here into this bus. Then what I'm going to do here is add saturation. So you can really feel the top end elements are folding in under the bass. And then after that, I'm taking out all the lows. So you don't actually hear that bass in this bus. And that's because we've got our bass channel over here. That's the one that you hear in the mix. This one is just being used as a destruction tool to crush the top end elements. And I'll play that in the mix. I'll play this from a bit later in the track and you can really hear how those elements are crunching. And another thing to note is the fact that the bass isn't constant all the way through the track. They've got these big gaps where there's no bass at all. And that's really important because you want moments where there's loads of pressure and everything's being crushed. But then you want those moments of relief where everything's a bit cleaner and there's no bass in. And then it creates that contrast. And something else I've done on this squash bus to emphasize that even more is I'm using an envelope follower here, and that's taking the bass signal, because I've got the headphone icon there, that's actually taking the bass signal from elsewhere in the mix and bringing it back into this channel. And then what I'm doing is using envelope followers, and then here I'm using the amplitude of the bass to then push up this macro, which is brightening the hats and the rides just when the bass hits. So it's all a bit of a spaghetti junction of stuff going on, but it's all done to give that pressure effect. And then there's a little filler bass in here. These stupid little wobby, weird wibbly sounds. And this is from a stem I made a long time ago. It says 2021 on the date there. So yeah, I've been making stupid wibbly noises for many, many years. They make no sense on their own, but in these gaps in the track, they just add a nice little bit of bass weight. Now let's look at a few more details in this track. So we've already looked at this group of things being distorted, but I mean the actual sounds in there's quite a weird noise sound running through the track. I mean, it's crazy weird. I think I used a plugin called Fracture. Is it Glitch Machines? Fracture? And I just recorded a load of stuff. This was for another project. It's a very odd texture. Then just before the drop, we've got this vocal sample. I've used Color Copy on this. This is one of my favourite plugins. In the comb section, you've got all these cool comb presets. Now, in these sections down here, we've got these elements here. I didn't want to use just standard risers because I think the track has more of a sort of analog feel to it. And just using like a Serum rising patch or something does sound a bit too kind of EDM. I wanted it to sound different and a bit weirder. So what I've got is I've taken this sound, and now if I take all these effects off, going from the name, this is the pre-drop vocal, and I've done something to it here and just looped it over. And I like to do that sometimes. I like to take a piece of a sound, it could be any sound, a bit of a sample or a bit of vocal like this, and I'll just loop it over and I'll treat it like an oscillator, and then I'll add effects like this to transform the sound, maybe with automation, and that will generate some kind of texture or effect for the track. So if I turn these effects on, you'll hear this is turned into some kind of a percussive riser. So yeah, just some weird sound design in the background for momentum. And then on top of that, we've got some delay feedback pitching up, and that gives it a nice analog feel too. And something else worth pointing out in this track is the snare. I've actually got 3 different versions of the same snare here. So each 16 bars, the snare changes ever so slightly. It just gives the track a bit of a different feel as it progresses. So the first snare, the second snare, and the third snare. So I pitched one of the layers differently for each section, and then I recorded each to a new track. Something else interesting about the snare in this track is that I used this Cassette plugin, and it's giving this sort of warbly distortion to the snare, and it's constantly changing throughout the track. And I normally wouldn't want that on a snare, but it seems to work in this particular tune, just because it's always slightly changing and evolving. Once I was happy with the track, I bounced all the individual tracks to stems and loaded them into a new project. And I do this quite often. I haven't really done much mixing here because it was kind of already as it needed to be, but I just like to do this so I can archive the track. In the future, I can open it up and I know that it'll play properly. Anyway, that was my breakdown of Dead Climb. Hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, leave them down below in the comments. And if you want to check out this track or the rest of my music, I'll leave it all in the description below. Cheers.